I'm loving the cold weather here recently and the opportunity to wear all of my cozy layers and to add a few more to the collection. This wool ponte fabric was perfect for this pattern, Vogue 8854 View B. It has a high collar with snap closures as well as a button loop for a statement oversized button. And there's also a front pocket to keep your hands warm out and about. I love this sweater because it has a bit of a poncho feel to it and it's just roomy enough to accommodate layers underneath. I've sewn a size small here and could have even sized down to the extra small. Celebrate the season with this fashionable outerwear. Let's get sewing. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of your collar and your right front facing piece. Here is one of my front bodice pieces and we're going to reinforce this inner corner. On your pattern piece, there's a dot indicating the pivot point of these reinforcement stitches. We're going to sew about 1.5 inches of stay stitching to the dot, then pivot and stitch another 1.5 inches along the other edge. Repeat to reinforce those inner edges for both front pieces. Then snip to but not through the dot for both inner corners. For the loop piece, we're going to fold both of the outer long edges to the center and give that a press. Now that both of those long edges are pressed to the wrong side, we're going to fold it once more in half and pin the open edges. Edge stitch along both long edges. Bend this strip to form a loop, then align the raw edges right sides together at the dots on the top of the right front piece and pin in place. Baste the edges of the loop in place. Place your front pieces right sides together and align this lower center front section. And pin. We're going to sew from the dot that we clipped to earlier to the bottom of the garment with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And we're going to double stitch this section. After sewing that first row at 5/8 of an inch, we'll sew once more from top to bottom with about a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Place the right front facing piece right sides together with the right front bodice piece. Align your notches and pin in place along the side and bottom edges. We're going to sew the side and bottom edges of this facing with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, stopping your stitching at the dot transferred from your pattern piece, which is once again the same dot that we clipped into at the beginning. Now I'll trim the seam allowances of the sewn section. Turn the facing right side out and give it a good press. Now I'll pin together the neck edges of the facing and the top of the bodice and baste in place along the top edge. Now along the bottom edge of the facing for the left front piece, we're going to press that bottom edge to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch, and then trim that pressed edge to 3/8 of an inch. Then we'll fold the left self-facing to the wrong side along the fold line transferred from the pattern piece, and give that a press. Then baste the facing in place just along the curve of the neckline. Turn and press both long side edges of the pocket to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, then an additional 3/8 of an inch for both sides. Then we'll baste those pressed side edges in place. Now to reinforce those hemmed side edges of the pocket for the openings, top stitch between the circles on both side edges, from circle to circle. I've gone ahead and pressed the top and bottom edges to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to trim them down to 3/8 of an inch. Place the wrong side of your pocket on the right side of your front bodice piece, aligning the dots and pin in place. We're going to edge stitch along the top and bottom of the pocket, and for the sides, we're going to top stitch from the top and bottom edges to the large dots which indicate the pocket opening for both side edges. Place the front and back bodice pieces right sides together and align the shoulders and side seams. Pin in place on both sides. We're going to sew the shoulders and side seams in the same exact way as we sewed the center front seam earlier. Sewing each seam first at 5/8 of an inch, then sewing each of them once more at 3/8 of an inch and pressing all of the seams toward the back of the garment. I've gone ahead and pressed the long unnotched edge of the collar to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to trim it to 3/8. Fold the collar in half right sides together along the fold line transferred from the pattern piece and pin the side edges. Sew the side edges of the 5/8 inch seam allowance, catching that folded edge that we pressed under. Trim the seam allowances and top corners, then turn this piece right side out and give it a good press. Place the unpressed edge of the collar right sides together with the neckline, aligning the dots and notches, and pin in place. Sew the collar in place from the left to the right finished edges of the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance and then press it up toward the collar. Now place the opposite folded edge of the collar over your stitching line, and you can pin in place to secure. I'm going to use wash away Wonder Tape, which is easier to baste without pins. Once the collar is secured in place, you can stitch from the outside, stitching in the ditch of the collar seam, making sure that you are catching that inner folded edge of the collar. Here's my right front flap piece. We're going to edge stitch from the top to the bottom of the flap with a 1-inch seam allowance. We're also going to do the same for the left front piece, sewing from the top of the collar with a 1-inch seam allowance, the same distance as we did on the right. Fold your sleeves right sides together and pin the underarm. For both sleeves, sew each seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, then once more with a 3/8 inch seam allowance as we've done previously, then press those seams toward the back. With the bodice inside out and my sleeve right side out, I'll place the sleeve right sides together with its corresponding armhole. Pin in place at the underarm seams, match the rest of your notches, and pin in place all the way around. Repeat to insert both sleeves. Then we'll sew all the way around both armholes with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, then once more at 3/8 of an inch and press the seams toward the sleeve. Place the right front over the left and pin the bottom edge of the right front flap. Edge stitch the right front to the left front right along the fold of the bottom edge. I've gone ahead and folded the bottom hem to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch. I'm choosing not to tuck the raw edge under by 1/4 of an inch as in the pattern instructions to reduce bulk in the hem. I'm just going to edge stitch close to the raw edge all the way around the bottom hem. I'll also fold the bottoms of the sleeves to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch and pin all the way around. Repeating for the bottoms of both sleeves, then I'll sew the hems in place Once again, edge stitching close to the raw edge on the insides. On the inside of my right center front piece, I've marked where my snaps will be placed. I'm going to separate my snaps and sew the ball section in place along the right side at the markings. Then I'll place my right front over the left to determine where I'll place the opposite half of the snaps. Then I'll sew the other pieces in place. Now with everything snapped in place, I can determine where I want the button to go on the left side, and then sew it in place. And now the top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.